Hi, everyone. So, we are going to be talking about fiscal policy, but there's another concept that we have to understand in order to analyze what happens when the government takes action by either cutting taxes or increasing their government spending. Um, so, this is called the multiplier effect, and throughout the course, there's actually going to be more than one time that we talk about multipliers. This one is going to be the fiscal policy multiplier, and later on when we get into the Federal Reserve, there's also something called the money multiplier. So start off by asking yourself a question. Why do cities want the Super Bowl in their stadium? So if you think about that for a second, you might come to the conclusion that, hey, a lot of people come to visit the Super Bowl. 50 to 100,000 people come to go to the game. They usually come for longer than one day, and they usually spend a lot of money. So an initial change in spending will set off a spending chain that is magnified in the economy. So here's an example. Bobby spends $100 on Jason's product. Jason now has more income, so he buys $100 of Nancy's product. Nancy now has more income, so she buys $100 of Tiffany's product. The result is a $300 increase in consumer spending and a $300 increase in GDP. So to just articulate this a little bit further, I went to a Seattle Seahawks game this year. I flew up there with a friend. I stayed in an Airbnb. We went up there on Saturday, spent the whole day, went to the game on Sunday, and didn't leave till Monday. So what did we do in the meantime? We ate 6 meals out of varying costs. We went shopping in the downtown district. We brought gifts back for our family. We took public transportation. And so if you add all that up, there was definitely a multiplying effect of that event, that football game. That spending would not have taken place if that didn't exist. So for example, if the government spends $5 million, will aggregate demand increase by the same amount? So we know that government spending, the G in GDP, that would go up by 5 million, but would aggregate demand go up by more than 5 million? And the answer is yes. Aggregate demand will increase even more as spending becomes income for consumers. Consumers will take that money and spend, thus increasing aggregate demand. So, for example, if the government spent $5 million on creating a new building at Central Oregon Community College, well, that building gets built by construction workers, and that $5 million becomes part of their income, and then they spend that money that they did not have before, and so aggregate demand increases much more than that. So how much? Well, it really depends on how much of the new income the consumers save. So there is, so if they save a lot, spending and aggregate demand will increase less. So if we take that, spending on the building at Central Oregon Community College, if those construction workers save most of that income, then aggregate demand will not increase as much as if they spend a lot. If they save a little, spending and aggregate demand will increase a lot. So that gets to this concept called the marginal propensity to consume, or the MPC. So this is the idea of how much people consume rather than save when there's a change in income. So think about this for yourself. If you get a Christmas bonus or a change to your income or an extra dollar per hour at your hourly wage, how much of that extra dollar are you going to consume versus save? So this is always expressed as a fraction, and here's the equation. You should probably write this down. But it's the change in consumption over the change in income. And so it's going to be presented as very, very simple fractions. So here's an example. You received a $100 bonus and you spent $50 of that and you saved 50. Well, your MPC is going to be 0.5. If you received $100 and you spent $80, then your change in income was 100, your change in consumption was 80, so it's going to be an MPC of 0.8. If you received 100 and spent the entire $100, your MPC would be 1. Oh, I'm sorry, actually, I misspoke. If you spent 100, your change in income, yeah, it would be 1. Excuse me. So now your marginal propensity to save is going to be obviously the reciprocal of that, the exact opposite. So it's also expressed as a fraction, but this one is your change in savings. So if you received 100 and you saved 50, obviously 0.5. If you received 100 and your marginal propensity to consume is 0.7, then your marginal propensity to save is 0.3, right? Because you can only spend or save $1. There's nothing else you can do with it. So if you're consuming 70 cents out of that dollar, then you're saving 30 cents. Okay? So the marginal propensity to save is 1 minus the MPC, and it's obviously it's obviously very easy to do this in your head. And this is true because you can only save $1 or consume $1. There's nothing else that you can do with it. So let's actually watch how this multiplier works. So let's assume for the moment that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.5 for everyone, meaning anytime you get an increase in income, people save half and spend half. So assume the Super Bowl comes to town and there's an increase of $100 in Ashley's restaurant. Ashley now has $100 more income. So she saves 50 and she spends 50 at Carl's salon. She goes to get a haircut. Well, Carl now has $50 more income. He saves 25 and spends 25, right? Because he always saves half. And he goes to Dan's fruit stand to pay that $25. And Dan now has $25 more income. This continues until every penny is spent or saved. And so the total change in GDP is the multiplier, right, times the initial change in spending. So in this case, if the MPC is 0.5, how much is the multiplier? So the spending multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to consume, or 1 over 1 minus MPC. Obviously, those are the same thing. So in this particular case, the spending multiplier is going to be 2. It's a very simple fraction. 1 over 0.5 is 2. So if the multiplier is 4, how much will an initial increase of $5 in government spending increase the GDP? Well, it obviously will increase it by $20. How much will a decrease of $3 in spending decrease the GDP? And it works both ways. It will decrease it by $12. So going back, so let's do a little bit of practice. So we know that the spending multiplier is 1 over the marginal propensity to save, or MPS. So if the MPC is 0.9, what is the multiplier? So if you come over here and you say, well, the MPC is 0.9, what does that actually mean? It means that we're spending 90 cents out of every dollar. Well, that means we're saving 10 cents. So 1 over 0.1, the multiplier is actually going to be 10. The multiplier is going to be 10. That's a huge multiplier, right? The more that people spend, the less that people save, the more the multiplier. So that's a multiplier of 10. If the MPC is 0.8, you know that the MPS is 0.2, and 1 over 0.2 is going to be a multiplier of 5, right? If the MPC is 0.5, we know that the multiplier is 2, right? 1 over 0.5 is 2. And so here the question asks, if the MPC is 0.5 and the consumption increased $2 million, how much will GDP increase? Well, you know the multiplier is 2. The spending is 2 million, so GDP will increase by 4 million. So here's an interesting one. If the MPC is 0, meaning they saved every dollar, okay, and investment increases by $2 million, how much will GDP increase? There will be no spending multiplier, right? Because every dollar is saved, and so the spending the GDP will increase by $2 million, exactly how much the government spent, okay? This is one of the reasons that some economists worry about giving tax cuts to the wealthy, because they know that they do not spend as much of it as middle class and lower income folks. So the conclusion, as the marginal propensity to consume falls, the multiplier effect is less. So you really want people to spend in order to increase the multiplier effect. So let's do a couple little practices here. So Congress uses fiscal policy to manipulate the following economy. So you're looking at this and you can see that we're in a recession. It looks like there's a $500 billion gap, and the MPC is 0.8. So what do? Well, first you find out what the multiplier is. If the MPC is 0.8, it means the MPS is 0.2, and that means the multiplier, if you 1 over 0.2, is going to be 5. So we know that the spending multiplier is 5. So whatever the government spends to close this gap is going to be multiplied by 5. So what should we do? Well, we already established this. The gap is a recessionary gap. We need expansionary fiscal policy to close the gap. We could either, to answer number 3, we could either cut taxes or increase spending. We're going to get to a bunch of this later. But how much do we need to close this gap? Well, if we have $500 billion that we need to close and the spending multiplier is 5, how much do we actually have to spend to get it to close? We only need to spend $100 billion, and the spending multiplier will take care of the rest. Okay? Let's try one more. That will move the aggregate demand over to long-run equilibrium. Let's try one more. We have a different situation here. Here we have an inflationary gap. So we need this economy is overheated and we need to contract it a bit. So what are our two options? Well, it's only taxes and spending, so we either have to raise taxes or decrease spending. And here it looks like, if you look at the numbers, it looks like we have a $20 billion gap, inflationary gap. So here it looks like that the MPC is 0.5. So that means that the MPS is 0.5 and that the multiplier is 2. So it looks like in this case we need to shrink spending. If there's a $20 billion gap, we need to shrink spending by $10 billion and let the spending multiplier close that gap. Okay, and we need to decrease spending by $10 billion. So hopefully you're starting to get this, but there's one last thing to talk about with our final minute. Changing taxes are a little bit different than changing spending. It also applies when the government cuts or increases taxes, but it's a little bit different. Changing taxes has less of an impact than government spending. And why is this? So let's say that we were cutting taxes, and let's say that the MPC is 0.75, so that there's a 4, the multiplier is 4. If the government cuts taxes by $4 million, how much will consumer spending increase? It is not 16 million. If the government spent that money, it would be 16 million, but if they cut taxes, it's not. Well, why is that? Because when people get the tax cut, it goes to the individuals first. It does not immediately get spent in the economy. And so consumers save a quarter of that, because the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, and they spend 3 million, and that 3 million is